All right, there we go. We are live. You are live. I am live. Eric is live. This is Everybody Settle Down. That is the great Eric Messersmith. I am the very average Charlie Marlow. How you doing, Eric? It's been a while. I had a little issue last week. We couldn't do a show. You know, it's also the holiday season. People are focused on Christmas and presents and all those things. But how the heck are you?
Well, first of all, I would say you are solidly above average. I mean,
Oh,
don't
thank
sell
you.
yourself short. I like the glasses. That's a new look, I think, on the show. You look much more sophisticated, I would say. Yes, it's been too long, Charlie. I have had multiple people, by that I mean like 3, that have said, where the hell have you and Charlie been? They look forward to their Everybody Settle Down podcast or YouTube show every week. And we've let the people down, Charlie, but we're back now. We're back, baby.
We're back. And I will say, though, look, take no offense, yourself, Brian Johnson. You guys do that on Tuesday nights. So I usually post it Wednesday morning, sometimes late Tuesday if I can. But on this channel here, we have a lot of political discussion. That's a very good show. I enjoy that show.
You. And how about the fact that he and I always start the show with the tagline, we grew up together in central Pennsylvania. It's specifically Altoona, Pennsylvania. I never would have imagined that Altoona, Pennsylvania would be like the epicenter of national news this past week.
Okay, let's start there. For those that didn't watch or listen to take no offense. So Luigi Mangione, which seems like not a real name, right? And we'll get to right. Everything. We'll start here. We'll start with the whole situation going on. But he's picked up at a McDonald's in Altoona. I think this is look, it's a crazy story. There's tragedy. There's just a million layers to it. But like, if you're from Altoona, you have to know that McDonald's, right? Like, dude, I went to that McDonald's and had a birthday party there when I was 6 or something, right?
Right. Yeah, there aren't that many, if I recall. God, it's been a while since I've been to Altoona. I go like once every 3 years now. But yeah, Plank Road right there. That's a busy busy road in Altoona, as busy as it could be in a town of like 40 or 50,000 people.
Okay, so look, I've followed this story. I haven't followed it nearly as much probably as you, but why was he in Altoona? Is that where he's from? He's from Baltimore area, right?
Yeah. So from what I understand, things are coming out in bits and pieces. I believe he grew up in the Baltimore area from a wealthy family.
Yeah.
And was like the valedictorian of his private boys' high school and actually have the valedictorian speech he gave floating around on the internet. He also has ties to the San Francisco area. I think that's where his family lives now. That's where I think his mom reported him missing. He lived in Hawaii for a while. And so I've seen people on the news being interviewed that knew him or lived with him there. And so the guy's been around. As far as I know, there are 0 ties to Altoona, Pennsylvania. But like Altoona is off of an interstate about 5 hours from New York. So it's not crazy that he would leave and end up, in that area near the Pennsylvania Turnpike and Interstate 99. But it is just so weird that of all the places, it would be Altoona. Look, I love Altoona from there, but I don't know if that's where I would want to spend my last hours of freedom, at the McDonald's on Plank Road in Altoona.
Okay, you said you've heard from his friends, and I'm guessing, tell me if I'm wrong. I did see a clip on X. That's where kind of I get my news and whatnot. I don't watch a lot of TV. I don't watch a lot of news, but I do consume a lot on X. And I did see the Jesse Waters interview with the dude from Hawaii. It seemed like almost like a commune type situation. Did you see that interview?
No, I didn't. I did not see it.
For people who haven't seen that, I mean, this guy, it's like almost like a community. It seemed like they had book clubs, and this guy kept talking about, oh yeah, he was great for the community. Like everybody's helping each other. I think it was some type of surf. It was called Surf Club or something like that. And it was just kind of a really odd interview. Like the dude wasn't that odd, but it seemed like the place where he was living. And look, I'm not here to judge, but it just seemed like a very free-spirited, kind of like almost like a hippie type commune situation is the vibe I got from the interview.
Yeah, and then there's the thing about he hurt himself, and apparently this is probably, we don't know for sure the motivation, that he suffered a pretty bad back injury surfing and had to have, there's a picture going around that he posted apparently where there's screws in his back. I was watching Sanjay Gupta on CNN with his little, fake spine model explaining it the other day. And look, back pain is among the worst things, right, that you can have that are like non-life threatening. And anyone who's had back pain knows that, or known someone who has had it. And obviously, when you're doing that, you're dealing with health insurance companies. And so I'm sure somewhere along the way, he was denied for a claim or had a lot of out-of-pocket expenses. And then clearly that because if you look at his life, this is not somebody who's grown up, on the streets, was a drifter for most of his life. Like, grew up in a wealthy family, was very successful, incredibly smart. He was in the tech industry, and then dropped off the face of the earth a few months ago. And his mom filed a missing persons report. There's social media posts where people are like, hey, where are you? What happened to you? So it looks like, we don't know for sure. We'll find out more. The back injury maybe was the thing that both turned him so vehemently against the insurance industry to the extreme that he would go murder the CEO of one of the major health insurance companies, but also that maybe sent him down a spiral of disassociating with society and being in a place where you would consider doing something like that.
What I think is so interesting about this situation, and obviously the situation is not the same, but if you go back to the dude, I forgot his name, is it Matthew Thomas Crooks or Thomas Matthew Crooks, whatever, the guy who obviously shot at Trump and then was killed. People still now are wondering, why don't we know anything about this dude? How come he had no social media? And maybe he didn't, but it's just odd nowadays. And I think the difference with this Luigi Mangione, and we'll get to the whole story here, but it's like, I look on Twitter when I see the name, I search it, and you see this dude's got all these followers, but it's followers after the fact, obviously, that are following this dude. And then, so again, I'm really only active on X. I'm sure maybe this dude was on other social media, but like, this dude was very active on X. Like, you could go back through his tweets and, he was commenting on all kinds of different things. And apparently he had this, there's a site where you can rank and rate books, and he was reading a bunch of books and leaving different reviews and all that. And it's interesting because, like, with the Trump shooter, I still feel like, that was how many months ago was that? 5, 6, 7 months, whatever.
June, I think.
Okay. I don't know anything about this dude. And I feel like in 1 week or so, you can literally know everything about this Luigi Mangione because there's so many pictures and there's so much social media activity.
Yeah. And he clearly became radicalized at some point in his own way. And he was quoting the Unabomber on some social media posts, Ted Kaczynski, and talking about some of the things, basically saying, I disagree with what he did, but his manifesto is pretty cool and he had some good ideas, is basically was his take. And that was his hot take. And I think it just shows you, like, the common thread of the guy who fired at Trump, this guy. So a lot of these threats, we're seeing a massive uptick, at least in what we know about threats to Congress people, to people associated with Trump. There was a story the other day. Marjorie Taylor Greene had a bomb threat called in at her house, which of course turned out to be fake. But this kind of thing is happening all the time. And while the emergency personnel was en route to her home in Georgia, there was an accident where they crashed into someone and killed a 65-year-old woman. So this is happening more and more, where members of Congress, high-profile people, are getting either attacked or threats of attack or fake threats of attack. And we're in a scary place, man. We really are. That's kind of all these cases are different and unique, but in many cases, these are lone wolves. These are people who, as far as we know, acted alone, were radicalized in some way by themselves, as not necessarily part of a larger group. And the internet obviously has a lot to do with that.
And you mentioned the Unabomber. Again, if people want to go back and watch that clip from Jesse Waters, I think it was only about 3-4 minutes, but there is kind of a funny exchange where this dude, who's the guy that lived out there in Hawaii with Luigi Mangione, so they had a book club. And this guy, he said he was the one, not Luigi, the guy that was interviewed, he's the one that suggested they read the Unabomber's manifesto. And Jesse Waters was kind of like, well, why would you suggest that? And by the way, I'm the type of person where I would read something like that too. That doesn't mean I want to send bombs to people. I watched the Unabomber. It was either a documentary or it was a a made for whatever Netflix type show. It was super fascinating. And I think there's some interesting correlations to the Unabomber because he's been brought up that this Luigi Mangione was reading his stuff and all that. What's super interesting about the Unabomber is if you really get into that, you probably walk away from it thinking the U.S. government had a decent amount of blame with radicalizing him as a child or a teenager, a young college student, like a prodigy. He went to college super young, and he was essentially part of that MK Ultra program, right? I mean, as a very young college student, I think he was only like 16, 17 years old that he was in college, and he was going through all this. Basically, it was a training where they're trying to learn how to break down like Soviet spies. Like that's all out
I didn't
there.
even know
This
that.
is not right. This is not conspiracy theory stuff. Like you can look this up. So that's what's crazy. But then also, so I think if you really do your homework on the Unabomber, you would say, you know what? I think our government had a hand in radicalizing him. However, I don't feel like there's sympathy towards the Unabomber for his actions. And it sure seems like, not seems, there's a lot of sympathy towards this Luigi Mangione out there on the internet. I mean, a lot of people cheering him. And I don't know what the percentage is, but I was shocked by that. Right?
Yeah.
Like this is still vigilantism. This is still cold-blooded murder. And I know we always joke on this show that two things can be true at the same time. You can be against the healthcare system and what's going on, and they're screwing people over, and also not be for straight up murder. And it does seem like, again, I don't know. I don't like doing the straw man thing, right? But it seems like it's kind of overwhelming on X that a lot of people are on this dude's side.
There's that sentiment is out there, and it's look, I think it's mainly on the left, but there's even a few conservatives like that I have seen that have said similar things. And look, there's different strains of it, but in general, it's, well, I don't feel sorry that the guy died, and it goes as far as I actually think the murder was justified. You've heard people make that connection, and that is just, it's crazy because as we know, you can't. And Josh Shapiro, I thought the governor of Pennsylvania in Altoona the other day, made a great point where he was like, you can't justify this just because you that's not how we solve political disagreements in America. But again, more and more it's starting to happen. And I think getting back to the two things can be true thing, like Elizabeth Warren, this is a good example of this. So it's the Democratic senator for Massachusetts. She was on MSNBC the
Pocahontas.
other day. Okay. Pocahontas, yes, more commonly known as Pocahontas, as Trump would say. And she's getting some shit mainly from conservatives for this quote, but I actually kind of agree with her. And she said, violence is never the answer. This guy gets a trial who's allegedly killing the CEO of United Health, but you can only push people so far, and then they start to take matters into their own hands. And I think she's right. She says up front, violence is never the answer, condemning the violence, right? Again, getting back to the two things can be true. Violence is never the answer. Absolutely. But when people are pushed really far by injustices, which, let's be honest, there's a lot of that in the healthcare industry, some of them, a small, tiny percentage of them who maybe are mentally unbalanced, are going to snap and potentially try to do something violent, in this case, succeed. That doesn't mean in any way that it's justified, and we should call out the people who are trying to justify this. Now, I think some of that is people just making jokes, like the people that were doing the one-star reviews on Yelp of that McDonald's in Altoona and saying there's a lot of rats there, or like the women who are saying, no, he was with me, or like they're creating these memes where they're dressing him up as like the Luigi character in Super Mario Brothers, like Free Luigi. There's a whole, like the guy is pretty attractive, I guess. And so you have this culture of people being like, this guy, I want to marry this guy. So I think there's a lot going on here, right? But the sentiment of it's in any way justified is crazy. We cannot live in this Brian Thompson guy who was killed. He may have been the worst human being in the world. I don't know. He had a job where, let's be honest, the job of the health insurance industry, particularly at the high levels, is to make as much money as they can, and they do that by denying claims, right? So I'm not in any way saying he was a great guy or the health insurance industry is fine, but we can't be having vigilante justice, right? That's wrong. But what Elizabeth Warren is saying is, let's not just completely dismiss the fact that that industry, the way it is set up, the way it has evolved over time, drives people to potentially do something crazy, because you and I know this, and so everybody knows somebody, or it's happened to you yourself, where you have been denied a medication you need, denied a treatment you need, or the price is exorbitant and you can't afford it. You get some massive bill. God forbid you end up in the hospital for a period of time and you don't have great insurance. It is not a good system. It's good for some people. Our healthcare system at the top end and in certain areas and certain people with good insurance is as good as you can have in the world. Like, people come here from other parts of the world to get treatments in some regards. But if you look at overall for 335 million people and you compare us to other wealthy democracies, our costs are the highest, usually by far, in any survey I've seen. Our results are at best middle of the pack. And in some cases, we're at the low end of certain things compared to wealthy democracies like life expectancy. And we don't even cover everybody. We don't have universal care. So we're not covering everybody. The costs are crazy. A lot of people are getting screwed. The results are terrible. People are going bankrupt in some instances. In some cases, people are dying because they can't get access to the care they need. Like, the system is a mess. And that anger, to me, is the fascinating part of that story and how that anger manifests itself in the defense of this guy, right? This guy was sticking up for the little guy who's getting screwed by the big health insurance company. Now, that's, again, I don't agree with that.
Like Robin Hood.
I understand it. And that anger is real. And we're in a populist moment in our politics, clearly. And whatever party can tap into that, I think there is a big opening there. And by the way, I don't say that as someone who thinks that that's necessarily wrong. That's what politics should do. It should address inequities in our system that are harming people and come up with solutions to them. And that, in healthcare, man, that might be one of the biggest examples in our country right now of a system that needs to be changed.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, and I feel like you always have to preface with saying this. Again, you can say, this is so dumb to say. It's like, Mark McGuire, steroids is bad. Murder is bad, right? This guy should not have taken this into his own hands whatsoever. But at the same time, this dude, Luigi Mangione, I think he essentially achieved what is his goal, right? Which was to enact change. And it did blow open this whole conversation about the healthcare system. And you probably saw what the next day, there was a company that wasn't going to allow anesthesia throughout, right? And then they kind of reversed that decision. And I don't know if that's because of this story, but the timing was very, very interesting. So to me, what's really interesting is that part of it. And you said earlier, whatever Elizabeth Warren said about pushing people too far. And this is not just about the health insurance industry. When I started to kind of read about this story, it kind of reminded me of people going postal. You know what I'm saying? Like, back in the day, we used to say it's going postal. You'd have these stories of postal workers, disgruntled postal workers. Something would happen, whether it was they got fired or you get a divorce or you lose some money, whatever it is, and somebody goes in and shoots up the post office. And it became a joke, like a disgruntled postal worker. But I agree with you in the sense of, if economically people don't feel like they have a fair shot, that is when people do snap. And here's a dude, Luigi Mangione, who's super educated, had all the money in the world, and he snapped. But there's a lot of other people that can snap. Like, back in the day, it was the postal worker. And I do think you talk about populism. Look, everything in our country over the last, 20, 25, 30, 40 years, you see all the different graphs about, hey, back in the day when the middle class was really strong, unions were strong, and the CEO to worker ratio was like 35-1, whatever that number was. Like, we've all seen that. Going back 40 years ago, middle class very strong. A lot of people were succeeding. And whatever that number is now, I think it's 300-1 or something of that ilk, right? Like, all of the money and all the resources are leaving the middle class and they're going to the top 1% of the country. That is 100% happening. You cannot deny that. And that is where I think we're going to see more folks snap. Somebody like Luigi Mangione, but also just kind of your average normal people that are going to, go postal. I unfortunately think we're going to see more of things like this.
Yeah, absolutely, because violence has become this kind of political violence, because I would classify this as political violence in a way. It's become more and more common and more acceptable in our country. And there's a lot of things, reasons for that leading up to that. There was the shooting at the congressional baseball game by a Bernie Sanders supporter that almost killed Steve Scalise, who's now the number 2 Republican in the House. There was obviously January 6th when luckily very few people died, but many officers were injured. And that could have been really, really bad. We narrowly missed maybe a mass death event, on that day. But in terms of how it relates to politics, because to me, look, we know this guy's guilty as hell. That's obvious. We know that what his motive is, and we know what he was trying to do, and we know the support he has, and probably why he has that support. But how does that translate into our politics? I think I saw a thing today. This is from John Favreau, who was who's the political guy. I think he's on Pod Save America, working the Obama administration.
The Obama speechwriter.
Does political focus groups. And so he said he was writing about focus groups. He did. And he said, most interactions with voters aren't as satisfying as you hope, and some are just bizarre. When I was conducting a focus group for a podcast I host called The Wilderness, a Latino voter in Vegas told me that his 2 favorite political leaders were Governor Ron DeSantis and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because they were both, quote, outsiders who were willing to, quote, take on the establishment. An older Milwaukee voter said that he had voted for Barack Obama and then Donald Trump because, quote, they both felt like change. A young black man in Atlanta said that because of crime and inflation, he regretted his vote for Joe Biden and that, quote, at least Trump is an honest liar. So I think what he said there, and then somebody else followed up on that. And I want to give this person credit because I thought this was a really good point. And I'd never kind of thought of it this way, but he took that anecdote, those anecdotes that Favreau shared, and he put it into a theory. And he basically, his name was Derek Thompson. So Derek Thompson is a writer for The Atlantic. And he took what I just shared there with Favreau, and he said, I think there's something very profound, possibly obvious, but maybe a bit overlooked by the pundit class in this. Here's what came to mind when I was reading. I think maybe political messaging is like a song. There are lyrics, the words being said, and then there's music, which is what most people feel when they listen. Political and policy nerds are lyric people. We're wired in a weird way. Fixation of words, policy, implications. But I think a lot of people, when they listen to politicians, they're listening to something more like music, which operates at the level of feelings. And populism is a genre that crosses all of us like popular music. And so what he's essentially saying is, it's not, we may think it's weird that someone loves both AOC and DeSantis, right? Like if you follow politics, you're like, how could you? They have completely opposite worldviews. They disagree on 90% of the issues. How could you at the same time love both of them, right? How could you go back and forth between like Obama and Trump, 2 people who, again, completely different worldviews? But it makes sense in that most people aren't looking at every detail or even many details of policy. They're looking not at the lyrics, but at the music. And the music is, I'm an outsider. I'll fight for you. You're getting screwed by the big establishment. Let me make it better, right? And so that then, if you look at it through that prism, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense how you could vote for AOC and Donald Trump, as people in her district did. It makes perfect sense why you could love Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And that is what I think the Democrats, to a large degree, missed with Trump, is they tried to focus so much on the lyrics, because the lyrics with Trump were pretty crazy. Like, it's hard to be a populist when you're trying to repeal, as he did, the Affordable Care Act. We're talking about healthcare here. Like when you're trying to essentially take away from many people the health insurance they have. It doesn't make sense, but it does make sense as I'm an outsider, I'm a fighter, I will get it done for you. And that's maybe what Democrats got away from. Democrats got so into the weeds of the technicalities of everything. And they got into and I talked about this a lot during the campaign. I thought one of the biggest mistakes they made was focusing so much on January 6th and Trump trying to overturn the election, which, again, I agree with those things.
Mm-hmm.
But you had those people. The people you didn't have are the people who are like AOC and Trump, right? Those are the people you needed. And those people are not about the lyrics. They're about the song. And the song should have been, I will fight to make your life better. And here is how, when it comes to things like healthcare, because getting back to what we're talking about here, because Democrats could have easily said, we are the party that wants to expand health coverage. Like, you can make that one of the centerpiece of your campaign, as Bernie Sanders did. And here's how we're going to do it. And this guy doesn't really want to do that. He says he does, but instead they were too busy talking about January 6th, again, which I understand, but I'm talking about what's the most effective strategy. They were talking about the crazy thing Trump said today. They were trying to pander. They were talking about Latinx people, which even Latinos don't like. They were they were doing all these things rather than what they need to get back to, which is the music of populism with real tangible things behind it. And I think if there's one lesson out of this election for Democrats for 2028, 2026, and then 2028 and beyond, it's laser focus on what you and I are talking about here. How do you mentioned the wealth gap. Starting in the 80s, it exploded, and it's not really turned back since. How do we make the lives of ordinary Americans better when it comes to lowering the costs of healthcare, education, childcare, housing? That is that's it. And anything else is like a secondary issue or something you don't even talk about at all. Like, laser focus on that. That is what people care about. And if you sing that song to them and you actually also have real policy behind it, rather than just Trump's, well, I have concepts of a healthcare plan, that is the winning message. It's right there. It's the silver lining that came out of this election for Democrats. The playbook is right there for you.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned people who'd vote for AOC and Trump. They're both seen as disruptors in different ways, right? AOC is the young bartender, populist. Trump, even though Trump looks like all these career politicians, he's not, even though he is kind of part of the establishment. I mean, he's a real estate billionaire from New York, but he's been able to paint himself as anti-establishment, which has been great for him politically. And then also, I think about the election and I wonder, I know technically the election was still close, even though Republicans basically made small to medium-sized gains almost everywhere. But I wonder if any Democrat really had a chance unless they totally broke free from Biden and Kamala, right? Like, it almost had to be, I think, a new Democrat that totally separated themselves from the Biden administration. Because you were saying something about, like, what's going on right now in the world and all that. And I feel like the Democrats, they had to play defense the whole time. And in playing defense, they were defending the establishment, right? Which everybody is so much against. And I will say, it's so easy if you go on and you watch right-wing news and all that. For the last 4 years, everything was the worst it's ever been. Like, the worst country in the world, the worst economy, the worst crime, all that, right? But that messaging works. Now, it's not true, but it's easy to say it's the worst. We're terrible. Now, if you watch our coverage now, everything's great, right? Everything's great because Trump won. But it's funny because, like, Democrats were in a really tough spot, or Kamala was in a really tough spot because she's in the administration. But it was like, well, listen, folks, it's actually not as bad as you think. Okay, inflation might be bad, but it's not as bad as Europe. And okay, you're saying that inflation's bad, but actually the stock market's really high and real estate's really high. Well, people that don't have any exposure to the stock market. They're not getting any gains. Like, they don't own their home. Their rent has went through the roof. So inflation is the tax on them. And even everything with like crime, it's like, well, it's not as bad as the 70s. And don't get me wrong, crime, I don't think crime is as bad as it's ever been, right? And 2020 is when crime really went up. But like, the argument from Democrats, and I feel like JD Vance made this argument really well when he was on that one interview where they're like, this is wrong. There's not these Venezuelan gangs taking over multiple apartment buildings in Colorado. There's only one. And JD Vance was like, well, how many apartment buildings being taken over by Venezuelan gangs is okay, right? Like, and again, you can get in the nuance of that. This is all in the gray area, but like, that's a tough argument to defend. Like, guys, these Venezuelan gangs are a problem, but they're not nearly as big as a problem as these people are making out to be, right? Like, they were constantly playing defense.
They were. And some of that was just natural in being part of the incumbent administration when it was unpopular, and around the world, incumbents are unpopular and people just have this sense of unease, right? But the point is, how do you, like, let's imagine an alternate scenario where Kamala's still the nominee, or maybe it's somebody else, but instead of going after and kind of critiquing all the crazy things Trump says and trying to, correct the lies and focusing so much on democracy and January 6th, what if they had just been laser focused on those cost issues of how to make life better for working class and upper middle class people? Because really, unless you're very wealthy, you're struggling in America right now. Now, struggling is relative, right? For some people, struggling means literally, I can't afford my next meal. I don't have a place to live. For other people, it means my car's broken down and I can't fix it. For other people, it's, well, I can't take a vacation with my kids. Or I'm living paycheck to paycheck. Yeah, I might have a decent house and I might have a couple of cars, but I have nothing, I have nothing saved for an emergency. And I'm one auto accident, I'm one health emergency away from like real trouble, right? That covers basically all Americans somewhere in that spectrum. And look, the other lesson too for Democrats is this is not about being too far left or too far towards the center. That's the wrong lesson, I think, because Trump was all over the place. Like, if you look under the head at his proposals, across the board tariffs, if he does them, that's a terrible idea. It's going to lead to higher prices, right? He doesn't really have a health insurance program, but it doesn't matter because he spoke the language of, I can make it better for you. You're the little guy getting screwed. Let me stick up for you. That's what Democrats used to do. That's how Bill Clinton was elected president and won an overwhelming re-election. Learn from the leaders in the past who did that and did it successfully. And that's what the Democrats should do. But they were so scared of their own shadow that Kamala was afraid to be bold on healthcare, for instance, like Bernie was. She was afraid to say, yes, of course we're going to cover everybody, and here's how I'm going to do it. And yeah, it may be expensive, but we're going to get it done. Like, she was afraid to be bold even on childcare. Like, yeah, we can do this in America. Why can other rich democracies figure this out where they can cover the cost of childcare for most people, but we can't? But they were so scared of their own shadow, they didn't want to have that fight. But what Trump should teach us is the details you can figure out later, but make the case on the broad policy so people know what you're for. So many people didn't know really what Kamala Harris was for. But if she had laid out an aggressive agenda and hammered it home every day of lowering costs and providing things like healthcare and childcare, some people would have disagreed with that. Some people would have said, well, it's too expensive. We would have gotten into those debates, but at least you would have known this is where she stands. She is with us. We're struggling. She wants to give everybody healthcare. She wants to give everybody childcare and college education, but instead they're busy talking about other things, because what do the interest groups care about? The people who write the checks, the people who organize. And in America, a lot of these organizations that have power, they're not made up of a lot of people. They're made up of very dialed in people who have very specific interests. They care about things like, on the Democratic side, abortion, right? They care about trans rights, LGBTQ rights. These things that, again, we can argue the merits of them, but that is not clearly what is going to win you the election. Like, the abortion issue is important. People care about it, but in most states, it's already kind of figured out. If you live in a blue state, you have the same abortion rights you did 3 years ago before the Dobbs decision. Nothing has changed for you. Nothing. And in a lot of purple states, that's true too. Hell, even in Missouri, where you live, they just passed an initiative, one of the more Republican states in the country, to legalize abortion again. And so it doesn't mean that the issue is not important. It just means it's not moving people in the way Democrats thought it would, because it's not really affecting the lives of most people in blue and purple states.
And also the fact that things change. Like, it 100% moved people in 2022,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And I think Democrats bet on the fact that, okay, it's going to move people again. And even though the people are more on the side of Democrats, even in a red state, you could say, you know what? If I would want to get an abortion, I have to drive to Illinois, right? Like, in this country, if you wanted to get abortion, you could still go somewhere essentially and get it. Let's move on to Daniel Penny being acquitted of those charges there. Want to get your take on that. My thing is, just from what I've read and what I've seen, I offer Penny the benefit of the doubt. Like, to me, these, and I don't mean to make it a pun here, things aren't always black and white. Like, there's a lot of gray in this, but from what I've seen, there's enough that I would offer Daniel Penny the benefit of the doubt in terms of trying to help in this situation. Now, on the other side of it, I think you could say, okay, could he have let up a bit at the end? Could this man still be alive? There's also some talk about the police response, right? That this man was still alive when the police responded there. But big picture, when you have a guy on the subway threatening a bunch of people and saying he's going to kill people, and you do have somebody step up to try to protect people. Look, I know it's not a perfect situation, but from what I've seen, I would side with Daniel Penny. I'm not saying he acted perfectly, but in this situation, I don't think he should be found criminally responsible for his actions.
Yeah, I think that's where I am too. I think it is a little more nuanced than either side kind of has made it out to be. Of course, we went because it was a high profile case involving a white man and a black man. You had people go to their camps right away and kind of side with the side that you thought they would. But I think there is some nuance here. I think the jury got it right, though. And because of the way that it started, which even the prosecution admitted during trial, they were like, yeah, they basically said, yeah, he was justified to step in. This guy was causing a scene. He was threatening people. It was a scary situation. The people on the subway car complimented him, helped him, some of them, to subdue this guy. So even the prosecution admitted, yeah, it probably started out okay. Now, when it came down to involuntary manslaughter, now you're getting down to a standard of kind of just, were you negligent, right? That's really what it was. Mm-hmm. He was not being accused of first-degree murder or second-degree murder. This was, were you negligent that resulted in somebody's death? And you could argue that because he held it so long, I think it was 6 minutes, and the last minute or so, he wasn't moving. You could make that argument. But I think there is enough reasonable doubt for sure because of how the situation started. And when you're in, it's easy for us to second guess not being in that situation. But when the adrenaline is pumping and people are scared and you're trying to subdue somebody who is dangerous, and that person also has some underlying health conditions that also could have contributed to his death as well, I think there's certainly enough reasonable doubt there that I think that the jury got the verdict right. But look, it is sad that somebody who was clearly had some mental health problems was having a mental health crisis is dead. I mean, that we can say both those things, again, getting back to our theme, could be true at the same time, that the jury made the right verdict, but it's another black mark on our kind of how we deal with people who are on the fringes of society and are having mental health issues and are having criminal interactions. Like, this guy had a long criminal record, but never kind of got the help he needed to get him to a better place, and now he's dead.
Because John Reibold asked this, I wasn't
planning on
talking
John?
about this. John is commenting a lot here, which we appreciate. He says, no talk about Biden pardoning Hunter. Seems suspicious. Now, you guys on Take No Offense handled that last week. Last week, we didn't do the show just because I had a little family situation. So I haven't really given my take on that. I know you did, Eric. But, and it's not funny, but like, my response, I guess it's because I hold these politicians to so low of a standard that it didn't shock me at all. And I really don't care. And the reason I don't care is because, and I hate to be like the whataboutism guy, but that's kind of how you have to be. Like, you have to be fair. And when you see all the people that, like all the Bannons of the world that Trump pardoned after his first presidency, and we also know, look, they went after Trump for some stuff that they only would have went after Trump for because he was running for president. I'm not talking about the January 6th stuff, but some of the other stuff, the Stormy Daniels stuff. In the same way that, it was Biden's DOJ that's going after Hunter Biden, but there was political pressure to do that. If he wasn't Hunter Biden, he would not have been sought after for those charges. So I don't know. I guess my reaction was much less than a lot of people. Like, I truly don't think it's a big deal. And the reason I don't think it's a big deal is like, that's what we've gotten to in our politics, that these guys, they pardon their friends and family members and cronies, and their family members get rich. And I kind of expect, like, that's the swamp that I've come to expect. Right. So like, I don't know. It wasn't a big deal to me. I feel like it was maybe a bigger deal to you when I watched the Take No Offense and some other people. But like, when I see all these people like, this is such a travesty. And I understand that Biden said the whole time that he was not going to pardon Hunter. So maybe that plays into it. But like, if you look at polling and surveys, and I said this 6 months ago, like, I would 100% pardon my son. 1000%. I wouldn't even hesitate. So I don't know. I didn't think that was a big deal. But the reason I didn't think it was a big deal is because Trump already did it. Trump's going to do it again, by the way, with anybody related to January 6th. So I'm just like, to me, this is the ugliness of politics, and it's not unexpected whatsoever.
That's true. I think if you look at it from that prism, you certainly can understand it. I think I said I admit my hypocrisy here because I don't agree with the decision, but I probably would have done the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think so what bothers me, I am a little bit bothered just by the pardon itself, because I think it's a terrible precedent. Like, you're right that Trump changed the game in regard to this with a lot of the cronies that he let out. But that doesn't mean you have to play the game, because that is something Democrats used to have the advantage on. And it's one of the reasons, as I said the other day, that Biden won in 2020, is because he was more of the quote unquote normal guy. And I get it. Well, in theory, but I think even in practice up until this, because look what he did. His Justice Department prosecuted his own son. Could you imagine if Eric Trump or Donald Trump Jr. was doing anything in the next Trump administration? Like, is there a chance? It would never come to a pardon, because Pam Bondi and the Justice Department would never go after him. They're not even going to go after Republicans, I don't think, in general. Like Ken Paxton, who's the Attorney General of Texas, has a federal investigation. My guess is that'll probably be dropped. Compare that to the Biden administration, where you had Menendez, a long-term high-ranking senator from New Jersey, who was indicted, tried, convicted, he and his wife, of bribery charges. That happened during the Biden administration. Do you think something like that will happen where a Republican will happen to a Republican during the Trump administration? I don't think so. So I think Biden had the right idea and followed it through. I think what happened is, clearly he thought he was going to win. And he never, when he was saying, no, I'm not going to pardon him, he assumed, well, I'm not going to have to, because I'm going to win the election. They'll work out a plea deal, and he'll serve very little, if no, jail time, and he'll have no future threat. But what made it worse for me wasn't even the pardon itself. If he had just said, you know what, on these two charges, I'm going to commute the sentence of my son. Okay. To me, there were two things that made it worse. Number one was the lying, or I don't know, maybe he just changed his mind, to say over and over again, no, I will not pardon my son. I will not commute his sentence. I believe in defending the Department of Justice and saying, I'm going to let the chips fall where they may. I defend the system. And then going back on it, it's a terrible look at the very least. And then the other thing that really bothered me was in the pardon announcement, the way that he attacked the case. Again, he could have just said, I disagree with the jury verdict, I'm going to commute my sentence. But he didn't do that. He went a step further and said, no reasonable person would have brought these charges. his own Justice Department through a special counsel brought them. So he's essentially making the same argument that Donald Trump makes, which is it was a political job, and they were out to get my son, right?
I did it.
Rather than just pardoning him and not saying anything. So not only are you throwing out the verdict of a jury, not only are you undermining what you've said and what you, to your credit, have stood for your presidency, which is some wall, some separation between the Department of Justice and the presidency, which is very important in our system and is about to go completely out the window with Pam Bondi and Kash Patel at the FBI. You know, God help us all. But not only have you thrown that away, but you've done it while attacking your own Justice Department, essentially parroting the same attacks that Trump makes against the justice system, which is, well, if it's against me or my family in this case, it's bad. And that to me is what made it so problematic for Biden. Look, is this the worst thing Biden did? No. Is this going to be in the first paragraph
What was the worst
of his legacy? Well, I said the other day, to me, and I think
the debate.
I am not a Biden hater at all. Anyone who watches this show knows. I think Biden legislatively was an incredibly accomplished president. Now, we'll see how much of that stands, how much Trump and the Republican Congress can undo. Some they probably will be able to, others they won't. But as it stands now, you cannot argue with the accomplishments. But there are three things to me that will forever mar Biden's legacy and just really diminish his chance of being remembered, I think, as a really good president. This is the least of them, the pardon. Number 2 on the list was immigration. Mm-hmm. And the way that there was a story that came out the other day. The New York Times did an analysis. Over the first 3 years of his administration, 21, 22, 23, we had a net increase in immigration of 2.4 million people per year, meaning 2.4 million people more came into the country than left, right? Legal and illegal, a lot of them illegal. That's 7 million people. It's going to go up to 8 million based on the numbers from this year. That's more than we have had in America ever in raw numbers. And as a percentage of our population, that's more than we've had since 1850. It wasn't just like they screwed up the border a little bit. Yeah. We understand that. Look, I mean, that's totally understandable. We live in a world where there's a lot of instability. People are fleeing to come to America. They're desperate to come here. But the fact that they didn't lift a finger until this year to stop that, for the most part, is just, first of all, I think it's probably the main reason why they lost the election. And it was just a dereliction of duty. But number 1 is running for re-election. I mean, that is because, as I said, one of his great legacies is that he was the guy who defeated Trump and then was a pretty accomplished president legislatively. But now those two things are completely flipped because his actions are arguably the biggest reason now why Trump is back. And that then threatens everything that you have built. The Inflation Reduction Act, which the capping of prices on prescription drugs, all of the projects, the chips. They're even talking about repealing some of the chips and science stuff, which I don't think they'll do, like re-onshoring, bringing that to America, building these advanced microchips that are right now just basically exclusively bought in Taiwan. All of these projects all over the country. Now, I do think the Democrats were smart in this regard that many of those projects, in fact, a majority are in red states and red districts. So it's going to be really hard to peel back some of that money when it's actually on the ground benefiting Republicans in their district. It's going to be hard for them to vote to do that. But it's on the table. And it's on the table for a lot of reasons, but mainly immigration, which you mishandled, and the fact that you decided to run for president when you were 82 years old. And when it was clear you weren't quite the same guy or weren't close to the same guy, you didn't have a way to get out until it was the very end. And now Kamala Harris, is in a tough spot, 110-day campaign.
Yeah, there's one of those big chip centers is in the Columbus, Ohio area. Huge, like billions of dollars of investment. I only know that because my uncle is a farmer there, and I know whatever company, it might be Dell. Don't Don't quote me on that. But like they came to a lot of the farmers wanting to buy up land because they have to build a bunch of houses for all the workers, that are going to come to those areas. So I think the Chips and Science Act, I think, is great for this country. Okay, Pete Hegseth. And I think so with me, it was more Matt Gaetz. I didn't really know a lot about Pete Hegseth, but what I kind of find funny, and again, I get most of my political news from X, just kind of scrolling, but I just see all these people on the right, and they're all kind of saying like, oh, they're going after all of Trump's nominees. Trump has a mandate. Trump should be able to get whoever he wants in there. And I kind of agree. I don't want to say whoever. I think when you win the presidency, you should essentially get almost everybody that you want into your cabinet. The only name that bothered me, and Pete Hegseth kind of bothers me just because I've read the story now, but I didn't know anything about the dude, right? Until now. The only name that bothered me was Matt Gaetz. Just I'm like, isn't this dude just like a total creep, right? Like just an uber creep, right? Like, can't you find somebody else who's as smart as him, but doesn't have all of this baggage, all of these crazy sexual stories, right? Like that was the only one I'm like, really? Matt Gaetz? And so again, not knowing anything about Pete Hegseth, but now because he's in the news, I've read this story, and basically, he's been credibly accused of sexual assault, paid this woman off in a settlement. The woman signed an NDA. And so I'm kind of reacting to the Republicans' reaction. But like my thing is, I really don't think most normal Americans care about your cabinet. I think they want you to get most of your people in, but I think they have a reasonable standard of like, can't we just have people who aren't pretty credibly accused of sexual assault, right? Like, can't you find somebody else with equal skills and background that doesn't have that baggage? So like that was my initial reaction to Matt Gaetz. And then that is to a lesser extent my reaction to Pete Hegseth, because I didn't know anything about this dude, but I'm reading the story and I'm like, there seems to be some smoke here for sure. But it's like, hey, you're going after all of his nominees. No, it's just like, can't you find someone else that doesn't have this baggage? Am I wrong? I don't know.
Well, no. Look, I agree with your large point about most people probably don't care that much about this stuff. I think that's probably true. I generally look, elections have consequences. And so I generally, if I were in the Senate, would defer to any president on the people they want for most things. I think the exception would be people who are clearly unqualified for their job because of their background or their personal actions or things they have said. And I think I would probably vote for most of these Trump nominees if I were in the Senate, even though they, in most cases, would not be the people that I would have picked. Although Rubio is kind of an exception. I think he's great for Secretary of State. I mean, that's about as good, I think, as Trump could have done. I think he'll sail through. But look, Gaetz was the worst because of his combination. It wasn't just the alleged sex with 17-year-olds and some of the other things. It was the fact that he is clearly a complete and total partisan hack who would have done Trump's bidding at the Department of Justice, as I just talked about, where there should be some kind of separation. At least Pam Bondi, who's the AG of Florida, has experience as a chief law enforcement officer and has some type of bona fides as a legitimate person to run that department. So I think she'll sail through. But then I think there's the group of the questionables. I think Hegseth, you mentioned, is one, not just because of his allegations of drinking and the sexual assault, but also because he's never really managed anything like this. And the Pentagon, you're talking about $1 trillion roughly budget, hundreds of thousands of employees, enlisted and civilian. It's a massive, massive responsibility. So I think his hearings are going to be quite interesting. But I think, look, he deserves a hearing, and so do the other people. Probably, if I were in the Senate, the people that I would really debate back and forth are Hegseth, RFK Jr. at HHS, and Tulsi Gabbard. I know, and Tulsi Gabbard at DNI. To me, they are the three most problem. And also, and I would not vote for Kash Patel. I mean, I think his past comments show you that he is completely unqualified to be the director, again, of an agency that's supposed to be independent from the president to some degree. And he's clearly going to do, whatever the hell Trump wants as the FBI director. But I think the three that are questionable are Hegseth, RFK, and Tulsi Gabbard. But they deserve a hearing. Let them explain their positions. Let RFK Jr. defend. And I have mixed feelings, as we talked about before, on RFK Jr. I think we talked about disruptors. We do need a disruptor at HHS. And yeah, Ace corrected me, John Rybaugh corrected me. It's millions of employees, right? Because there's over 1 million people just in our enlisted military, and then there's hundreds of thousands of other employees that at the Pentagon and the Department of Defense who are civilians. But I think with RFK, let him defend, because whether you like him or not, you have to agree he has said a lot of things that are verifiably untrue about many things related to health, which he is in charge of, particularly when it comes to vaccines. Let him explain those, let him justify it. But on the other hand, I also do think we are so fucked in America with our obesity epidemic, our chronic diseases, the food we eat, the pesticides, big ag. We need someone who can come in there and shake that up. And I think he would do that, or he would try to. Some of it would be how much would Trump let him? Like, it's one thing to say what RFK Jr. says. It's another thing to really make changes to big ag, which is one of the big donors to the Republican Party. And like trying to take that on and change the way that our agricultural system works, that will not be easy. And that will require Trump stepping in. And I just can't imagine Trump looking at the ag industry and being like, yeah, we're going to force massive changes on you. Maybe I'm wrong. I've said this before with Trump. He's in some ways he's kind of like a blank slate, and I hope I'm wrong about a lot of the things I think are likely to come, but I don't think I am. And so I think that it's going to be interesting with RFK Jr. But I think with Tulsi Gabbard, man, you're the director of national intelligence, and you have parroted the talking points of Vladimir Putin, of our adversaries. She has at several points undermined our own intelligence agencies. She's Bashir al-Assad, recently toppled dictator of Syria. Not only did she meet with him, which, okay, whatever, but then cast doubt on the fact that he had gassed his own people when there was obvious evidence, and everyone admitted that he did it. I mean, and just to say, well, I don't know if he's really a war criminal. Like, she's going to have a lot of explaining to do with those statements. Is that really the kind of person we want leading the intelligence agencies of America and giving the president advice and counsel about intelligence? So, but again, I think she does. Let her have her hearing. The elections have consequences. Many of these people would never be in these positions if it were not for Donald Trump. They owe that everything to Donald Trump. Like, there's no other administration, I don't think, where Tulsi Gabbard would be at DNI, where Kash Patel would be at the FBI, certainly where Matt Gaetz would have been put forth as Attorney General. But then again, they deserve a chance to have a hearing and let's see, how they answer some of these questions.
All right, let's end on this note, because it's been a lot about Trump. He is the Time Person of the Year, right? The Time Person of the Year.
Person of the Year, not Man of the Year, Charlie.
Oh, Person
of the Year.
I think that makes sense, right? Whether you like him or not, Person of the Year. I mean, the most impactful person probably in the world, I think it's fair to say. And again, whether you like him or not, whether you voted for him or not, it is an incredible comeback story. To me, it's a comeback story that shouldn't have been allowed because he tried to overturn the election. But hey, that's been swept under the rug. It doesn't matter anymore, right? That doesn't matter anymore because he won. So I get it. Person of the Year. He's the most influential, impactful person on the planet. So he should be Person of the Year, whether you like him or not.
Yeah, it's a good choice because I totally agree with what you said. And I mean, people point this out. Remember, Hitler was once the Time magazine, at that time, Man of the Year. So it's not necessarily a person doing good. It's just a person who's the most impactful. And he deserves that. Like, say what you will about the guy. He was dead politically after January 6th. I mean, done. Nobody wanted anything to do with him. He was essentially a man in the wilderness at Mar-a-Lago. And because of his, I don't know if genius is too strong of a word, but because of his abilities to make himself relevant, to understand media, including social media, to understand how to weave a narrative through just sheer force of will in his late 70s, maybe partially motivated by wanting to stay out of prison and make as much money as he can grifting along the way on sneakers and cologne and all the other things that he sells. Whatever the motivations were, you have to give the man an incredible amount of credit because they were ready to abandon him, and he just took the Republican Party back. Now, he had some help with things, the indictments and things like that did help him. The kind of the misinformation in the ecosystem of our partisan media, that helped him. So he didn't do it himself, but he was the primary driving force of that. And then to run a campaign, have it switched out on him near the end, he was behind in the polls, remember, and they just kept going, and they came back and they got
Was
it
he
done.
though? See,
well, he was behind when Harris took over. Well, if
hold
you
on.
believe the polling. Yeah, if you believe the polling.
And we're towards the end here, so we can get into this another time. But that story that the Harris, this is what, and I don't want to get into this because it's a whole different argument, but this is what pisses me off.
Next week. We'll do it next week.
Next week. The Harris, with that guy you mentioned, John Favreau, that Pod Save America. The Harris folks came on. They got ridiculed for that interview. They were very defensive. They said their internal polling never had them ahead the whole time. The whole time.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. I don't know. I would like to see that. I think they're doing a lot of ass covering, after this election. And rather than kind of taking a reflective look and think about it, if the polling was really close in their internals, which I bet it was really close, just like the public polling was really close. It puts you in a better light as the losing campaign managers to say, oh yeah, well, we were behind anyway. Everything was against us. What could we possibly do, right? We did the best we could, which there is some truth to that. They were put in a terrible spot. But I think it's important to remember the final popular vote margin was just under 1.5 points.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin were all 1.7 points or less. If she had won those, she would be the president. The polling was a little bit off, but not that much. The final popular vote margin was like maybe Harris by a half point. Trump won by 1.5 points. So it was off by a couple of points, 2 points, which is not a huge polling miss at all, way less than what we saw in 2020 or 2022. So I think the polling probably had it just like we saw it, just like it ended up really close. And it could have gone either way. But this is where you have to give credit to Trump and his team. They got it over the top. They knew how to speak that language of populism, which is what won it. Even as I said earlier, the music they got right, the lyrics, whatever, but they understood what people wanted to hear and how to appeal to them. And on the Harris campaign too, they needed to do some reflection. I blame Biden a lot more than I blame Harris, but they could have run a better campaign in some regards.
For sure. Absolutely. Let's end on that note. John Reibold says, if 2024 was a landslide, that means 2020 was a landslide.
The final margin ended up being a little over 2 million votes.
Yeah.
Biden beat Trump in 2020 by 7 million. So by that metric, Biden's win was 3 times the size of Trump's. But I will say this, I also don't like the Democrats downplay the Trump win. Yes, it was fairly narrow, but he won all 7 swing states. He won the popular vote as a Republican for the second time since the late 80s. George W. Bush in 2004 is the only time since the elder Bush in 88 where a Republican won the popular vote. And Republicans held the House, although the margin is very narrow, and that's going to be a big story next year. They have almost no breathing room in the House. But in the Senate, they flipped 4 Senate seats. They'll have a 53-47 majority. So, yeah, it was not a blowout. It was not a landslide, but it was a solid victory for a guy who, remember, just lost 4 years ago by 4.5 points and 7 million votes. That's the thing. It's not that he had a big margin. It's that he turned it around to that degree in 4 years and also swung the way he did it, too. Swinging Hispanic voters mainly. He did a little bit better, it looks like, with black voters. But the swing in Hispanic districts was crazy. Districts in California and Florida and Texas that had Hispanic populations of 60, 70, or 80% Hispanic, they moved to the right by 15 or 20 points, many of those districts, in 4 years. So it was not a blowout. It was not a landslide, but Democrats also should not downplay it either. It was a significant victory, particularly when you factor in the way that he did it.
For sure. And I think, look, I've had people tell me, Charlie, you wasted your vote because you voted for RFK Jr. I could easily have voted for Kamala Harris. Now, let's be real. My vote in the state of Missouri didn't really matter. But looking back, and maybe this is also me trying to like justify it, I'm glad the way I voted. And I'm actually glad if the Democrats were going to lose the presidency, I'm glad they lost the popular vote. I really am. And I think that was the bigger story. The bigger story of the election was not just Donald Trump winning. Okay, he could have won a close one, won Wisconsin or whatever it is. But the fact that he won the popular vote, to me, that now forces Democrats to look inward and change.
Yep.
And I think in the end, that's actually a good thing.
No, I agree. There's two big, if you're a Democrat, silver linings that come out of this election. First of all, or actually really three. The first one is there was almost zero split in the Electoral College and popular vote. I did not see that coming. I mean, based on what we saw in 2016 and 2020, it looked like Trump had a pretty decent advantage in the Electoral College. That was gone. So that's better for our democracy. I think it's just better for our democracy if the popular voting Electoral College start going the same way. And who knows what will happen in 28, but it looks like we could be headed toward an era where we have very little gap. That's a good thing. Number two, for Democrats, they did really well in the House. They won a majority of all the close House races. I think they won 17 of the 25 closest House races. And as a result, Republicans have won 220 seats to Democrats 215, but because of vacancies with Matt Gaetz, with Elise Stefanik, with Mike Waltz, it's going to be 217 to 215, which means Republicans can, if everyone shows up, cannot lose a single vote in the House. We know how crazy the House has been lately for Republicans. Look at what happened to Kevin McCarthy. That's going to be a really tough governing majority. And because the margin's so small, I would say it's 80% plus the Democrats win back the House in 2026, an off-year election. And then the third thing is what you mentioned. Having a decisive loss is better than a Florida 2000 loss.
A squeaker.
Right. Because it forces you to look in the mirror and make hard choices and a hard evaluation. And there are some Democrats, I think, who are in denial, but a lot of Democrats I've seen, I think, know this. I think they know that certain things hurt them, overplaying the democracy thing. Also, some of the trans stuff, particularly trans girls and boys sports, I think they know that really hurt them. Trans girls and girls sports, I should say. And I also think rebranding and refocusing on the economic message, getting back to what we talked about in the beginning, the economic populism of how do I make costs and life more affordable and life better for the average American? How do we get back to that? Because Democrats used to own that. That used to be their thing, right? That's what Bill Clinton campaigned on and won on, and to a large extent, Barack Obama as well. Trump, to some degree, took that away from them and made that populism a right-wing argument, which we haven't seen really in our lifetime, at least. And so getting back to that. And then the other thing is what John Rybald said, getting the right candidate. Let's be honest, I think it was, I'm glad Biden dropped out. I'm glad Harris became the nominee, but it wasn't an open process for obvious reasons. 2016 was not, it was open. Bernie could have won, but there clearly was a thumb on the scale from Democratic elites for Hillary, right? In 2016. Sure. In 2020, it was more open, but then everyone coalesced around Biden. But you need there's some stars in the Democratic Party. They need a completely open process. Let the best person win. And I agree with John Rybald. I really hope it's Josh Shapiro in 2028 because I think he's the guy. There are other good candidates. The Democrats have a very deep bench. But man, I just, you know me, I'm a big Shapiro fan. I saw the odds the other day. He had the second best odds in the betting markets. I think I put my money on Shapiro.
Who was number one? Kamala?
Newsom.
Oh.
But nobody had good odds. Newsom was number one, but it was like 15%.
Gotcha.
And then it was like Shapiro at 12. So It's early.
It's early. There's no way, in my opinion, Kamala Harris is going to be the nominee in 2028. I'll put my life savings on that.
I don't even think
chance.
she's going to run. I don't
No
think she's
chance.
going to run.
And she wouldn't win if she did.
Yeah. No, I agree with you.
All right, let's end on that. Everybody settle down. Charlie, Marlow, Eric Messersmith, everybody, thanks for watching. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. And we will see you next week. See you later. Eric, take it easy. End stream.